Hi, Ted Morrissey here at the historic Brown Hotel in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. I'm still in Louisville for the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture. And this is day 2 of the conference. I just wanted to do a quick video just with some takeaways from some of the panels that I went to share a bit with my students, both my graduate students, my MFA students, and my undergraduate students as well. And really interesting panels as always. The first one I went to this morning was really good. And it was titled Experiments in Autobiography and Life Writing, a reading of new work. And it was supposed to have 4 presenters, but 2 of them weren't able to make it ultimately. So the 2 participants were Kristen Nelson and Maggie Zarowski. And they read these autobiographical pieces. And the thing that really stood out to me was how different they were. And again, the title of the program was Experiments in Autobiography and Life Writing. And it appealed to me particularly because of that word experimental. As my Lindenwood students know, I teach a course in experimental writing. And so I'm very interested in playing with form and kind of working against various tropes and so forth. So I was very interested in seeing how they might be kind of playing with the traditional autobiographical form and what kinds of things were they doing and so forth. And again, both of them were very interesting. I found Kristen's presentation particularly experimental, so I'll just kind of speak to that. So what she had done was to write a piece about really bad breakups. When you're just head over heels in love with someone, and then the relationship just goes bloom overnight practically. What's that experience like? And she kind of the impetus for that was her own experience with that several years before she wrote this project, she pointed out. But she also, just having gone through it with friends who had relationships that imploded, and then just knowing that this kind of thing happens on a regular basis. It's just part of the experience of being human. She interviewed kind of informally a lot of different people about their bad breakups and things that happened afterwards, and how kind of we can go a little bit crazy in our reaction to being dumped, when we had really trusted someone. Anyway, she took her experiences and all these other people's experiences and blended them together in kind of a cohesive narrative where it really wasn't possible to tell like what came from her actual life experiences and what she had taken from somebody else's life experiences, and then kind of blended them together. And then, as if that weren't kind of avant-garde enough, she wrote them as a series of uh, prose poems. So she showed us on the page, because this book is coming out soon, and they're little blocks of text. They're not poems exactly, but they're in prose, but they take the shape of poems. And I asked her in the Q&A if she was particularly interested, as a poet would be, in like what words are specifically on what lines, even though it was prose. And she said she was, because she is a poet primarily, and so she was very interested in that, the lines, and making sure the words followed her original manuscript and so forth. And then, within those, she even played further with repetition and other kinds of poetic devices and so forth. So, again, very experimental, both in terms of blending other people's experiences, real life experiences, but still other people's experiences, with her own life experiences, but in a way that the reader or listener, couldn't tell the difference. And then also going a step further in terms of how they're actually presented on the page as these little blocks of text, right? And then one last thing, she arranged them chronologically. So, you kind of read through, June, this happens, then July, this happens, and so forth. Anyway, very, very interesting. Maggie's piece, also very interesting, a little more traditional in terms of the narrative. And in fact, I asked her about that. I said, this is an experimental, experiments in autobiography. What exactly is experimental about your piece? I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just because as I talk about with my experimental writing students, because I teach a course in experimental writing, is that experimental writing comes in all shapes and sizes. I think a lot of times we hear that term and we think, oh, well, these are just wildly experimental, the kind of things where there's graphic elements and the type is doing all kinds of stuff. And, you read it and you don't even quite know what it's about and so forth. Yeah, that's experimental. But experimentation can also be really anything that the writer is doing that is different from what they normally do. So they are kind of experimenting themselves. They're trying something new, trying an approach they hadn't tried before. And so, in her mind, even though the narrative was pretty traditional sounding, not very experimental, not like Kristen's, prose poems, blended, stories from multiple sources. I mean, Maggie's was very much her own perspective and told in a very chronological kind of way, but it was just part of a larger framework that she's working on. And that piece is experimental in terms of its sort of pushing back against certain kind of cultural elements that she encountered. It's about a trip that she took to Berlin. I think pretty recently. I'm not sure when she went to Berlin, but anyway, it's so in the small version, in the excerpt that we heard today, it's hard to see the experimentation, but within that broader context, it would be more experimental. But again, the thing I really want to emphasize is that experimentation is really just the author trying different things, experimenting with different techniques. And so the end product may not seem that experimental, that avant-garde, whatever you want to call it, to the reader, but the writer still was very much in an experimental mode in terms of the composition of it. So anyway, really fascinating panel, and we got into all kinds of interesting things about teaching narrative and teaching the personal narrative and that kind of thing. Also went to a panel on William Blake. Very good. I think the main takeaway that I had from was just emphasizing that William Blake, the poet, illustrator, etc., how his influence, stays with us. I mean, he wrote and did his illustrations in the early part of the 19th century, and here we are, 125, 130 years later, and still a lot of contemporary poets and artists and so forth are inspired by William Blake. And so that was kind of the main thing I was kind of taking away from. That's what I was kind of listening for in terms of the different Blake scholars and their presentations. Then I got to do my thing. I did a couple of panels. I did a creative writing panel where I read my Laertes sonnet sequence. I talked about the fact I felt a little bit like a fish out of water because I don't normally do poetry readings. I'm a kind of dyed-in-the-wool novelist, but I had submitted to the conference committee my sonnets that I had written that are collected in Delta of Cassiopeia, and they were accepted for presentation. And I mentioned the fact that while I don't really think of myself as a poet per se, I oftentimes in my fiction, in my novels particularly, have a character or two who are poets. And so I will write poetry in their sort of personas, but with my Laertes sonnet sequence, which I started in 2015 and then wrote over the course of a few years, I decided to step out from behind the curtain, so to speak, and write some sonnets in my own voice and submit them to journals and so forth with my name on them and so on. And specifically, they are sonnets written in apostrophe to my father, who had passed away in 2012. And as I mentioned in my kind of setup, I was having kind of a hard time processing what had happened, and I missed talking to my father, and I was interested in the sonnet form, and I always had been. So I thought, what the heck, maybe I'll just write some sonnets, and I'll, write them to my father, so they all are you, and so forth. Anyway, kind of dark though, not the cheeriest of subjects. A son writing, sonnets to his dead father. My presentation was really in contrast to the other two poets who were there, whose poetry was really funny, and we should have reversed things. I should have probably gone first and depressed everyone, and then they should have followed and, ended on a lighter note. But the other two poets, I'm not sure I can pronounce this one name correctly, Robin Rahija, who teaches at University of Kentucky, and then Dylan Loring, who is a professor or associate professor at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And they both read from collections of poetry that are forthcoming. And again, both really, really funny, laugh out loud funny. And we got to talking about that, the fact that these are serious poems. I mean, they're serious poets. They take what they do seriously. But yet the end product, or at least the poems they shared with us, were all very, very funny. Just hard to even to explain. Dylan read this long poem about these two, kind of narrative poem about these two roommates, one of whom decides that this particular window in the bedroom is going to be their defenestration window. That's what it's called when you kill someone by pushing them out the window. So it becomes like a serial killer luring people to their apartment and pushing them out the window. It sounds, how can that be funny? But it was really funny. And then Robin did an interesting project where she looked at Yahoo News headlines from like clickbait articles and would take the actual headline. So it's a found poetry project in a way. Take those found headlines from Yahoo News and then write little blurb poetry things, kind of playing off of these crazy sounding Yahoo News headlines. And again, just very, very funny. They're both publishers of poetry and small press journal kinds of things. So we talked a little bit about being publishers and editors, and why do we do that? Why are we interested in editing and publishing other people's work and so forth? So very, very interesting. So look them up. Dylan Loring, Loring, Robin Rahija, Rahija. I know she has a website. I haven't looked at Dylan yet to see if he has an actual website, but look for their books of poetry because you will enjoy them. I'm definitely going to get hold of them when they are available. All right, and then the other panel that I presented on was the critical panel, the scholarly panel, and there were just two of us because one of the presenters wasn't able to be there. But I gave a paper on the William H. Gass centenary, looking backward, looking forward, where I talk about my literary idol William Gass, and kind of part of my presentation was kind of introducing to people about his literary output and what he was kind of known for. And then the last part of my presentation was about things that are happening specifically this year because of his centenary, but then also things that scholars could be working on in the future because there's such a rich vein of potential scholarship. And my paper, like all my Gass papers, are on my blog, tedmorrissey.blog, so you can check them out there. While I was at the conference, I got the good news that the American Literature Association has accepted a proposal for a Gass panel at their conference in May of 2024 in Chicago. So I'm going to be doing a paper on Gass's collection Cartesian Sonata and Other Novellas, which I feel is, as I say in my paper, the most masterful of his masterpieces. And it doesn't get the kind of attention that some other works of his do. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be working on. Then I have a couple other presenters who are going to be doing some other things there as part of that Gass panel. And then also within the last day or so, I was contacted by a writer from the Los Angeles Book Review, and Los Angeles Times Book Review, and wants to talk to me, do an interview about the gas centenary and some of the stuff that I'm doing kind of as part of that or whatever. So that's super cool. So I'm looking forward to that. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. There's one more day of the Louisville Conference tomorrow, so I'll go to a couple more panels tomorrow. Just been a great conference as always. I'll really encourage anyone watching this to look into going to literature conferences, either to present scholarly stuff or to present their creative writing. As I say, the literature or the Louisville Conference is literature and culture. So it's not just presentations about literature like books and short stories and poems, but there are people who come there who are film people, who are film scholars, and they do presentations on film. There are people who are art scholars, and they'll do presentations on art, and so forth. One of the really interesting presentations in recent years that I've attended there was this woman who did her doctoral dissertation on reading museums. You go into a museum and it's laid out in a particular way. The exhibits, you have to kind of follow a particular pattern, to go through the exhibit halls. I mean, the exhibits oftentimes will have little placards next to them that kind of explain what you're looking at and give you a little bit of background information. A lot of museums, you can do audio tours. So they give you a little device and you pull earphones in, earbuds in, and you can listen to things about the different exhibits and so forth. Well, all that is very intentional. I mean, obviously somebody, or maybe several somebodies, had to make a bunch of decisions about what's this space going to look like? What museum items are we going to include? What order are we going to put them in? How are we going to word the little plaques that go next to the exhibits? What are we going to say in the self-guided audio tours? What kind of narrator are we going to have who's going to record those? Male, female? What kind of mood or tone are they going to have in their voice? And so those are all very specific decisions that somebody had to make, or again, several somebodies, if it was kind of done by committee. And it was all to achieve a particular effect. What do they want visitors to the museum to think about, whatever it is, right? If it's a historical museum about the city of Chicago or whatever, what is the theme there? What's the thesis that they hope people will take away from that, right? So anyway, she did a paper about her work reading museums, and what does a particular museum seem to be trying to say? So that was another way that culture works its way into this particular conference. But anyway, I'll stop there. I don't want to make this too long, but looking forward to getting home and getting back into my normal routine. But I have definitely enjoyed the Louisville Conference, as I always do.